So, picking up where we left off with Louis XIV. So he obviously has the nobles around his finger, basically. He used a couple of other methods to watch over them. One was he used censorship, which meant that, and of course the nobles didn't know this, but any letters that came to Versailles or left Versailles from the nobles were being carefully opened and read by the king's authority. So he was able to learn, again, not only from looking and viewing who was there, who wasn't, but who was talking negatively about the king. Those people would never gain favor. And therefore, the aristocracy just completely remains under his own individual scrutiny. That's absolute. It's like a dictator, right? He also created the prohibition of nobles having private armies, meaning if they ever did try to resurrect some kind of revolt, they would have no army for which to do it. That was very important because historically, nobles who were the officers of the army throughout Europe could wage local wars. They could basically, to a certain extent, sort of force the king to do certain things under threat of resistance and so on. For example, as we'll see later, King John of England being forced to sign the Magna Carta. But he prohibited that. And he created this system, as we said, that centralized his administration. So why was he known as the Sun King? Well, the idea was that Louis was the sun, and the nobles were the planets, and the planets rotated around Louis. The planets rotated around the sun. So Louis had them in the palm of his hand. And their lives revolved around him. And this is what is meant by absolute monarchy or the practice of absolutism. Louis even went so far before the Paris Parliament at one point to say, "L'État c'est moi." I am the state. And that is absolutism, right? In a nutshell. Lastly, about Louis XIV is what he was able to do in terms of consolidating money, particularly with his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was his finance minister from early on in his reign until later in his reign, and they were able to do things like keeping the nobles kind of happy, but also fiscally dependent on the crown in ways we've talked about, and also through what we'll later look at with the French Revolution, but the old regime in which the different estates or different classes of people paid large amounts of taxes. So what did he do with all the money he was bringing in? He did two things. One, he went to war. And he went to war with European powers such as the Dutch, the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish. But in doing so, he, of course, created a very large army and a professional army. What's the difference in Europe before Louis XIV in terms of an army, a large army? And a professional army? Well, typically an army would be raised by nobles. Those would be your officers. And they would bring people who were citizens, who were basically farmers, to arms. But what Louis creates is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year army. An army of people who, when asked, what's your profession? They don't say, I'm a cobbler, I'm a farmer. They say, I am a soldier, right? And so Louis creates one of the first professional armies in Europe. Prussia will soon pick up with that. And so he's able to win victories. He's able to create France as the most desired in terms of culture, society, fashion, art, and military. And that's what Louis leaves to France in 1715 when he dies. And we'll sort of pick up with that later with the French Revolution. I just want to quickly mention the other states. They're not nearly really as important, but they will be eventually. Prussia, this state within the Holy Roman Empire, a German state, under Frederick Wilhelm the Great Elector, who ruled from 1640 until 1688, basically laid the foundation for the Prussian state and certainly for the Prussian military. He was the one who built an army of 40,000 professional soldiers, the fourth largest army in Europe at the time. And he had built the Duchy of Prussia from a backwater into a powerful state. And, excuse me, he would also combine the areas of Brandenburg and Prussia into one state, making Prussia a much larger country. And eventually this would be used to build an even stronger army under Frederick Wilhelm the First and his son Frederick the Great, who we'll talk about later. Very important. What about Austria? Well, the Austrians are the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs are the most powerful and wealthiest dynasty in Europe, and will remain so until nearly the end of the 18th century. They have possessions, or they are on the throne from obviously Austria is their center. Vienna is their center, but on the throne of Spain. They control the Austrian Netherlands. They can control all these areas in the Balkans, in northern Italy. And they also control the Holy Roman Empire. The ruler of Austria is almost always elected the Holy Roman Emperor. And so the Habsburgs have incredible power within Europe, both, as I said, sort of financially, militarily, and with the Catholic Church. They, after all, are the emperor rules the Holy Roman Empire, which is part of the Catholic extension of territory, and so they're very much in the Pope's favor. And any ruler of the Habsburgs, there's no real particular one. They're all rule with sort of an absolutism, but they tend to rule much more with their dynasty in mind. In other words, they have to constantly think about how to protect all of their various territories. Ultimately, one ruler, we'll later talk about, Joseph II of Austria, tries to get them all sort of under one umbrella, if you will, and financially stable. He's not successful. But remember that the Habsburgs are the most powerful, the wealthiest of all of the European monarchical dynasties. And and therefore the other countries of Europe, the other powers, are always trying to diminish their power. That was a major reason for the 30 Years' War, and it's still a major cause of contention, particularly with this up-and-coming state of Prussia, which wants to gain its own power over Austria in terms of the German states. And lastly, that of Russia. And the figure here is Peter the Great. And Peter the Great, we could spend a lot of time on, but he basically was able to bring Russia into the modern period, which is to say that he westernized Russia. He brought it into Europe. Because if you know anything, about the geography of Russia, the majority of it lies beyond the Ural Mountains, meaning it's in Asia. Only a small amount, particularly during Peter's rule, was actually in Europe. So he wanted to bring Europe into Europe, westernize it, modernize it, enlighten it, and then create a powerful army and navy that would make it Russia one of the European powers. And by the time he's done, he basically did. Um, so he fought for constant expansion as Tsar of Russia. Where does the idea of Tsarism, of absolute rule by one person, come from? Well, Russia was under the rule of the Mongols for some 250 years. So they understood what it was like to be under one rule or one ruler. He expanded into the west, fighting the Polish and the Swedes, conquering lands, and conquered to the east all of Siberia, making it the largest country basically in the world. Peter the Great created this strong centralized monarchy after the ideas of Louis the 14th. And he created this great capital that was in the West called, after himself, St. Petersburg, which he called the window to the West. His major goal again was to westernize Russia, which looked a lot like it did back in the Middle Ages. And it was full of people with the nobles. They had long beards and these robes, and they practiced this sort of mystic or Orthodox Christianity. And he just started saying, no, 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 you must dress like the French, cut those beards off, and you need to look Western. And the ones that didn't, he often would grab them by the beard, rip the beard out of their face, and send the message, you'd better westernize, you'd better modernize. So he was bringing modern military ideas, particularly of the Navy. He considered himself a naval man, and he even went on about a year expedition through Europe, learning from the great shipbuilders of Europe, particularly in the Netherlands and in England, how to build ships with his own hands. He was a hands-on kind of guy, and he largely built and helped build the Russian Navy. And so he brought European military ideas, government ideas, the Navy, science, technology, all the things that had missed the Russians because they were so backwards. They'd missed the European Renaissance. They'd missed the scientific revolution. They'd missed the Enlightenment, and he was going to bring these things to them. But that created an incredible divide, of course. But the normal Russian was still a serf, still in this feudalistic society, in terrible conditions, of which they would remain until really the 20th century. We'll talk about much later. But what he was able to do, again, was bring Russia into Europe. And bring the nobles into at least some kind of modern nobility, aristocracy. He also created that great navy that he wanted, and he needed two ports for it. He needed one on the Baltic Sea and one on the Black Sea, which means he needed to control those. And that's why he fought wars with both the Poles and the Swedes, and also with the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. He needed those warm water ports for his navy. He would fight for those ports, and the fight would continue on later with Catherine the Great of Russia, who would also fight for those port cities. But he ruled with an absolute rule, as all czars did. But he brought Russia into the vanguard of European military and navy and so on, which Catherine the Great would later pick up. So these are the absolute countries. These are the absolute groups that are absolute figures that we wanted to look at. And so we'll move on here with looking at all of these countries through the Enlightenment, through enlightened absolutism, monarchy, and the 7 Years' War, and so on. And so we will continue looking at some of these figures and their importance in European and history.